I don't understand. All my life, I've been told I'm different, that I have a disorder, and because of that, I don't fit in. I've been called strange and weird and odd and special. I don't feel special. People don't listen to me, especially when I can't use verbal speech. It's been difficult to make friends and form relationships or even just survive. It's just really hard. It hurts. And maybe that wouldn't be so painful if I could just function better or fit in better, talk better. Things might not hurt so much.
Perhaps you function exactly as you ought to function, and you live in a society that isn't yet sufficiently enlightened
to effectively accommodate and integrate people who function like you. Maybe the troubles in your life
have not been the result of any inherent wrongness in you. Maybe your true potential is unknown
and is yours to explore. Maybe you are, in fact, a thing of beauty.
Hello, and welcome once again to Neurologic. I'm your host, Leo Jones. I'm gratified to have joining me today Dr. Nick Walker with their latest book, Neuroqueer Heresies, Notes on the Neurodiversity Paradigm, Autistic Empowerment, and Postnormal Possibilities. Dr. Walker is a queer, transgender, flamingly autistic writer and educator best known for her foundational work on the neurodiversity paradigm, her development of the term neuroqueer, and the concept of neuroqueering, and her contributions to fostering the emergent genre of neuroqueer speculative fiction. She is a professor of psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies and senior instructor at the Ieke Arts Center in Berkeley. Dr. Walker is also co-founder and managing editor of the worker-owned indie publishing house Autonomous Press with the fantastic tagline, Weird Books for Weird People, and has co-edited and contributed to multiple volumes of the annual Spoon Knife Neuroqueer Lit Anthology, published by Autonomous Press's Neuroqueer Books imprint. Along with her co-writer Andrew M. Reichart and artist Mike Benowitz, Dr. Walker is part of the creative team behind the urban fantasy webcomic Weird Luck. Words cannot express or fully articulate how pleased I am to speak with you. Welcome, Dr. Walker.
Thanks for having me here.
So I have read I have not finished the book yet. I'm still getting about halfway through, but I did have some questions. I found it very interesting. There's a lot. I feel like I'm going to be rereading it a couple of times just because there's so much to learn from it. So while I'm familiar with the neurodiversity paradigm and the definitions therein, could you describe or define neurodiversity and the neurodiversity paradigm?
So neurodiversity is essentially the diversity of human minds. And as I say in the book, people hear this neuro and they think brain, people think diversity of brains, but really our minds are intimately connected with our brains, but also our whole body. The brain is part of the whole living physical system of the body, and the way our minds are altered by the way we experience the sensory worlds and the experiences we have in life. So I think really of people, not as little brains driving around in bodies like people riding around in cars, but more I think of people as body minds, as a full system of an integrated mind and body. And so I would call neurodiversity the diversity of minds, or really the diversity of body minds. And it's the different ways, the diversity of ways that people function cognitively, that we know things and take in and work with the field of information that we all live within. the neurodiversity paradigm is a particular way of looking at neurodiversity. And so, as I explain in my writing, the attitude towards neurodiversity within the dominant culture, within society as a whole, is governed by what I refer to as a pathology paradigm. And in a pathology paradigm, the idea is there's an assumption that there's one right or natural or normal or healthy way for a human mind to function, for a body mind to function, really. There's a right way to move and to express one's embodied cognitive process, a right way of being in the world and knowing the world. And so there's one right way, and then anything that deviates too much from that is pathological in some way, is pathologized as a problem or a disorder. And so that's the pathology paradigm, which very much dominates how, for instance, just popular culture in general and also academic fields and professional practice see neurodiversity as either you're normal or you have some condition. And the neurodiversity paradigm is a different way of looking at human neurodiversity that says, okay, this is a form of human diversity, the way, say, ethnic diversity or gender diversity is a form of human diversity. And just like there's no one right or natural ethnicity or one right or natural gender, there's no right or natural way for a human mind to work. There's just a diversity. And so if you throw out that pathology paradigm, if you throw out the idea that you're either normal or disordered and just say, okay, there's a diversity of minds, then we start looking at this as a matter of diversity. And we can see, okay, well, with ethnic diversity and gender diversity and such, there usually is some, at any given time and place, a dominant majority or dominant group that's saying we are the one right way and everyone else is inferior. And the pathology paradigm is just another manifestation of that this, the fact that particular ways of being are assessed as being abnormal and disordered, being autistic, for instance, or being dyslexic. The fact that these are diagnosed as disorders and there's, professional practices built up around treating them and pathologizing them, that's just the social power dynamics that manifest around diversity in general, the same way that social power dynamics manifest around gender, for instance, and pathologize or abuse people who step outside of the heteronormative gender binary. So that is a basic explanation of neurodiversity and the neurodiversity paradigm.
It is something that I will admit it's I can understand it, as in I consciously can read the material and listen and understand it, but being able to apply it to where you don't fall into that pathology paradigm just out of just practice because of so many years living in a society that has that, it can be very difficult. So there are some elements that seem to be similar to what's discussed with the social model of disability.
Yes.
In what ways does the neurodiversity paradigm exceed the social model of disability, or at least embrace a much more inclusive perspective on the diversity of human minds, or as you term the body mind?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the neurodiversity paradigm is highly compatible with the social model of disability. The neurodiversity movement, there's the neurodiversity itself, the biological fact of our diversity of body minds as a species, and there's the neurodiversity paradigm, and then there's the neurodiversity movement, which is really, a civil rights or social justice movement about the rights of neurodivergent people who diverge from the dominant norm and are often pathologized and marginalized or abused because of how they diverge, autistic people, for instance. So the neurodiversity movement has been very much entwined with the social model of disability. It's really central, I think, to the movement, is the idea of neurodivergent people being disabled by living in a society that's not set up to enable them, that's not set up to enable their participation as equals and their inclusion. And so, in a sense, neurodiversity movement is a social justice movement really built around the social model of disability as much as the neurodiversity paradigm. But as you say, I think the concept, the neurodiversity paradigm does extend beyond the social model of disability. And I think something's lost if we think of the neurodiversity paradigm as just a paradigm for disability rights. You know, we already have a disability rights movement and a social model of disability, and there's essential work happening around that and around disability rights, around societal inclusion, around destigmatizing disability or finding ways to accommodate people. But there are a lot of ways to be neurodivergent. There are a lot of ways to diverge from dominant societal norms, and not all of them involve disability. There's a lot of autistic experience, for instance, of being disabled, sometimes very disabled, you know, in a society that has certain expectations of social and bodily performance, and, you know, social rejection of people who don't meet certain ways of doing sociality, or in a society that expects everyone to be able to speak all of the time and privileges spoken communication over typed communication and in-person interaction, you know, or expects certain kinds of independence around certain kinds of tasks. There's so many ways in which different autistic people can be disabled because society does not accommodate the fact that we have different sets of needs and different ways of doing things. But there's other aspects of autistic consciousness that really don't have anything in particular to do with that don't have anything particular to do with how we're disabled, but just what are our different experiences? What are our different cognitive experiences and ways of doing pattern recognition and sensory experience and understanding of self and other and a world, and which produces very distinctive autistic literature and poetry and art, for instance. That really doesn't have direct bearing on disability, except insofar as if you accommodate the needs of autistic people better, they get more opportunity to contribute artistic art and literature and science and thought to the world. But there's also ways of being neurodivergent that are not really disability at all. You know, the way that people's brains get altered from long-term psychedelic use or long-term meditation, or people who have forms of synesthesia that do not really change their needs in a way that results in disability, but definitely result in a very different sort of consciousness, which results in, a very different sort of art, for instance. So there's so many aspects, I think, to neurodiversity that extend beyond just the spectrum of abled to disabled.
It is rather, to be very honest, it is rather depressing that the current models solely seem to be revolving around if you're able to be employed in a very narrow set of circumstances. If you are able to be in a place for 8 hours a day dealing with all kinds of just sensory bombardment, if you're productive enough to a certain extent, just all kinds of things. What you brought up was it was a lot of things that I could remember, that when some of my friends who are autistic and otherwise neurodivergent, when they started working from home, a lot of them realized, oh, this is much more comfortable, and to a certain extent it's actually kind of nice. I feel like I'm not as stressed. Things seem to be better, and a lot of them were told that, oh, well, you need to work on this social skill, or you need to develop this, or find a way to cope. And it's like, well, if I'm at home, I don't have to do those things. So what's really going on here? I do want to kind of ask, we've discussed a lot about the paradigm and neurodiversity itself, but what do a lot of individuals or organizations kind of get wrong about neurodiversity, the neurodiversity paradigm, and other of the definitions within, that context?
Well, I think some of it we've covered in the sense that most people don't recognize the full scope of neurodiversity because they think of it as being entirely about, the able to disabled sort of continuum, and don't look beyond that to just the full, beautiful glory of the diversity of human body minds and the scope of potential human consciousness. So that's one thing. But I think also, as you noted early on in the conversation, with how hard it is to get into the habit of thinking with through the neurodiversity paradigm, the lens of the pathology paradigm is so deeply ingrained in the culture, much like, say, the lens of patriarchy and heteronormativity, for instance. It's so hard to teach ourselves, to train ourselves to see beyond that and to make an inner paradigm shift. And so I see people, either well-meaning people, I see well-meaning people or people who are just sort of appropriating neurodiversity as like a corporate buzzword or something. I see both, people who are genuinely trying and people not so much, but people get it wrong because they haven't really made the internal paradigm shift yet. And so people will talk about I'll see people talk about neurodiversity, then they talk about things like autism or ADHD or dyslexia as conditions, which is very much a medical term. It's very much in the pathology paradigm that you're normal or you have a condition. And so they're really still thinking, and then they're using the word neurodiversity, but they're really still thinking with the structures of the pathology paradigm. And so that's a big one. Similarly, I think we see this problem around diversity of any sort. People, I think this is the fault of sort of neoliberal capitalism and corporate speak, but diverse has become a euphemism for marginalized or oppressed, like marginalized and oppressed groups that's described as diverse. But in fact, everyone is part of the scope of human diversity. Everyone is part of the spectrum of human ethnic diversity because everybody has an ethnic background of some kind. And so it's not, but the way that you see like white supremacist culture talk about things is it's like, oh, white people are the normal people and everyone else has an ethnicity. And I see that same supremacist mindset come up with neurodiversity, where people think neurodiversity means people who are autistic or ADHD or dyslexia or have some specific pathologized cognitive style. But in fact, the entire human species is neurodiverse. We're a diverse species, and there's no human who does not fall within the spectrum of human neurodiversity. So there's the neurotypical, the people who conform to the dominant norms, and there's the people who diverge from the dominant norms, but we're all part of the spectrum of diversity. Nobody's somehow magically like apart from and above that.
I've had discussions with other autistics, and some of them are just, especially some of them are just newly exposed to neurodiversity. And while we have good discussions, for autistics and other neurodivergent individuals who may find themselves at odds with a society that is so inaccessible, so hostile to them, so narrow in what is permissive or established as the social norm, how can they adopt the neurodiversity paradigm in their own lives, even though the medical establishment and the pathology paradigm constantly tells them that they're broken and they need fixing? For example, an autistic who is unable to drive and hates being dependent upon others for transportation, or someone else who needs assistance with eating and drinking.
And I am unable to drive, by the way. It's a relevant example. Yes, it definitely affects where I can live. Yeah, so I mean, in a sense, a lot of that is about disability rights activism, and it's where the social model of disability and the neurodiversity movement as a disability rights movement comes in. How do we advocate for a world that's not, for instance, built around cars? And that's this, again, we have this idea that, so much, this idea of like universal design, where so much of what we can do to improve lives for people who are currently disabled improves everybody's life. If we built our towns to accommodate, to prioritize walking and bicycle and wheelchair traffic and motorized scooter traffic and such, rather than built our towns around the culture of the automobile, built very accessible light rail systems everywhere and such, instead of, more roads, and that actually makes a better life for everyone and a more sustainable way of living on the planet without setting the whole thing on fire. So it becomes, in a sense, disability rights activism combined with activism for environmental reform and urban reform and massive systems change of every sort. You start pushing against systemic ableism, and you discover, oh, actually the direction I'm pushing is sort of like, now I'm suddenly pushing against patriarchy and racism and capitalist mass consumer culture. It's like all of this is entwined together. So yeah, that's the whole systemic change aspect. But in terms of, the neurodiversity paradigm, again, it's first and foremost a mindset. And I come to it as an academic, as a psychology professor, and specifically, I train a future psychotherapist. So I'm often thinking about how, when I'm thinking about a paradigm shift, I'm thinking about how does this affect theory, and therefore how does this affect professional practice. But in terms of our everyday lives, the paradigm shift, there's so much possibility open by making a shift in our mindset. And we did the systemic change too, but the shift in mindset starts telling us what's possible. And that's, a part of, in the subtitle of the book, I use this phrase, postnormal possibilities. And I'm very, you see, as the book goes on, like this phrase, this term, this word possibilities pops up in my work a lot. I'm really just in love with the possible, and so much activism and so much attempt at social change, I think, dooms itself by being purely negative, and it's a very pessimistic, bleak attitude. And certainly things are messed up in so many ways in the world and so hard for so many people. But focusing on the possible is really essential. And I think that that's a key piece of the neurodiversity paradigm, is to think about what I call neurocosmopolitanism, this idea of what's a neurocosmopolitan future like? What is a world like that is actually integrated the neurodiversity paradigm, where we really do embrace and look to accommodate and enjoy the potentials and beauty of the full scope of human neurodiversity? And where can we start with that? Or even just on an individual level, no matter how terrible a person's life might be because of misfortune and societal oppression and whatever, that shift that says, there's nothing wrong with me, is a crucial shift. That shift that says, no, I'm not disordered. I'm not fundamentally flawed and broken because I'm autistic or because I'm ADHD or because I'm dyslexic. Just making that internal shift, there's something about that opens up possibilities, I think, that autistic people stay autistic. We stay autistic. And so if a person thinks autism is a terrible disorder and I'm doomed to a miserable life as long as I'm autistic, I'll be lonely and life will be hard because I'm broken, well, that doesn't allow for much possibility for improvement. But if one makes that shift and says, there's nothing fundamentally wrong with me, I deserve better than the way I've been treated, that opens up this possibility for something better to happen. It opens up some possibility of saying, okay, well, here I am working with the body mind I've got. What are the possibilities? What are the potentials? What are the little things even right now I can do to improve my life, having recognized that improvement is possible. So I think that that's a key thing in the neurodiversity paradigm that is easily overlooked, is that there's something fundamentally positive about it.
Part of the book that I haven't fully gotten to yet is discussing the term neuroqueer.
Yes.
You've put it in highly concise terms that you're neuroqueer if you're neuroqueer, before listing 8 points that frame the term really well. Could you talk a bit about the term and what you hope to see as it blossoms from what you wrote, as you called it, a working definition?
Right. So I came up with this term in 2008 when I was a grad student in somatic psychology. And my friend and colleague Athena Lynn Michaels Dillon actually came up with it at some point independently of me. And we'd sort of discovered many years later, 2013, 2014, that we were both playing with the term and started taking it a little more public. But it was something that originally for me came up in these early grad school papers as I was trying to describe my experience of working with this experience of queerness. What I saw, I was looking at how I had learned to pass or to mask, to suppress my natural autistic modes of embodiment and such, to avoid being under attack for it. And I was looking also at how I had suppressed my more feminine embodiments and put on this facade of masculinity, because there's this ongoing journey for me of coming out as a trans woman fairly late in life, and I haven't even started medically transitioning yet. But I was looking at both of these things, the facade of neurotypicality or neuronormativity, and the facade of heteronormativity and heteronormative, the shell of heteronormative male gender performance that I've been pushed to put on in my childhood for the sake of survival in a very, homophobic environment. And so what I started seeing was the similarities at first, was like, okay, there's heteronormativity, and then heteronormativity can be queered. This term queer is like as a verb, in queer theory and gender theory, queering is a verb. You queer heteronormativity. Essentially, you fuck with heteronormativity, you deviate from it, you challenge it, you queer it, and a person can be described as queer because the way they embody themselves and live their lives and their gender and their sexuality queers or deviates from heteronormative standards. And I was seeing neuronormativity works the same way, that neuronormativity is also this facade that's pushed upon us, and that we can queer it just the same way people queer gender. And as I looked at that more deeply, what I started to see was that neuronormativity and heteronormativity were in fact not even separable from each other, that ultimately they're entwined, that when an autistic child is being pushed to act like a non-autistic child, to embody neurotypicality, they're also in the process being pushed to embody their assigned binary heteronormative gender role. A child is subjected to ABA, to abusive behavioral therapy, to try to force them to act non-autistic. Nobody's trying to get that child to act like a non-autistic, non-binary child. They're trying to get that child to act like a non-autistic boy or a non-autistic girl. And gender conformity is very much part of neuronormativity. So there was this idea with Neuroqueer first that neuronormativity could be queered the same way heteronormativity could be, that our embodiment of our mode of cognitive functioning could be queered, just like gender and sexuality could be queered. And then there's also the idea that essentially, on some level, to do one is to do the other, that all of that normativity is entwined. And if you start queering your gender enough, it starts to alter your neurology. And if you start embodying your autism or other form of neurodivergence fully enough, you're also queering heteronormative gender performance. And so that's a big sort of entwined ball of interesting stuff to play with. And the term neuroqueer just kind of refers to all of that. And neuroqueering becomes just this way of extending queer theory into the realm of neurodiversity, and this way of looking at how neuronormativity and heteronormativity are entwined and how the queering of the two of them can be entwined.
I cannot wait to see how that evolves over time. I find that very fascinating. Finally, with just a few minutes left here, I wanted to ask how you came up with the title. We got the subtitle a little bit about where that came from, but the title itself, Neuroqueer Heresies, and maybe a little bit of what you're looking forward to the next year, whether it be professional or personal.
Oh, yeah. Okay, well, let's talk about the title here. So here's the story is I actually had that title in my head for a decade before I started writing the book. In 2010, some friends of mine who are mostly like a sort of a psychedelics experimenting crowd and had hosted some of my first public speaking gigs before I was doing public speaking in the academic world. These friends of mine tried putting together a little publishing house, and having done that eventually, having been a part of that with Autonomous Press, I can tell you that it's really hard, and it's still kind of a work in progress. It's really hard to do, and I think my friends underestimated how hard it would be. So they started putting together this publishing house, and they told me they wanted me to write a book for them about autism and neurodiversity and such. And I came up with the title Neuroqueer Heresies then, like before I knew it would be in the book. I was like, I'd been playing with this term neuroqueer and just sort of liked the concept that it was heretical in so many different ways. Of course, that publishing house never went anywhere, never happened. And I never actually didn't write a book because I was immersed in grad school, which turned out to be a very long journey. So yeah, when I set out to write this book, I was like, I guess this is Neuroqueer Heresies. This is that book that I was going to write. And I think it is heretical. I think I'm very serious about that because obviously it's heretical from the perspective of the pathology paradigm. If one is, it's absolute heresy if one is coming from the mindset of, conventional psychology or the whole pathology paradigm culture. It's also heretical even in terms of much of the discourse on identity, because a lot of social justice discourse and social injustice discourse, like white supremacism and such, a lot of that is built around an identity politics that says that, everybody has these fixed identities, these fixed essences. And the concept of neuroqueer really messes with that and says, no, it's more than just like, okay, you're either neurotypical or you're autistic or you're dyslexic or autistic and dyslexic or something. It's more than these identity labels and fixed essential neurotypes. It's not about anything as essentialized as types of brains. It's about a fluidity and the fact that things can be queered, that we can become neurodivergent, that standards of neurotypicality change and our experiences and such alter our brains. We can become neurodivergent regardless of what sort of brain we're built with by engaging in, psychedelics use or exotic meditations, and, play with the whole field of gender and body-mind performance. And so it's heretical from a perspective of identity politics too. So I think that there's something in there to offend any orthodoxy.
So, and just finally, real quick, just kind of what you're looking forward to the next year, anything professional wise or personal, possibly another book or just whatever's going on.
Yeah, there's going to be another book eventually. I do have a plan actually to turn my doctoral dissertation into a book, because it's a drag reading a doctoral dissertation, but I do want to. I have this dissertation about my experience as an autistic practitioner of Aikido and physical theater, and I want to I want to write a much more updated and accessible and fun to read version of that eventually, which probably will diverge massively from the original dissertation and address more gender stuff and such. So there is a plan for that. I'm not even going to start writing it until a year from now or something, though. Who knows how long it will take. Right now, what I'm enjoying is writing fiction again, now that I got this book done. So I'm writing speculative fiction, short stories. I have a webcomic called Weird Luck, which is just my favorite project in terms of the sheer fun of it. Me and a couple of friends, a co-writer and a wonderful artist. And so I've got this delightful urban fantasy webcomic that just is going to be a very long and intricate and wild story arc. So yeah, I'm just looking forward to more of that and more fiction writing for a while, and then it's back to the book writing thing in a year or so after I've gotten some fiction time and some comic time.
Again, the book is Neuroqueer Heresies, Notes on the Neurodiversity Paradigm, Autistic Empowerment, and Postnormal Possibilities. I've got all of your links. I will also be posting a link with the episode to the Weird Luck webcomic and that information. Of course, thank you for being on the show, and hope you have a good rest of your evening.
Oh, you too. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
I'm Leo Jones, and this has been Neurologic. Neurologic is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License. To view a copy of this license, visit creativecommons.org/by-nc-nd/4.0 or send the letter to Creative Commons, P.O. Box 1866, Mountain View, California 94042, USA. Neurologic uses the song Furious Freak, created by Kevin MacLeod, for its intro and outro music. Visit him at inconfitech.com. Furious Freak is licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 3.0 license, creativecommons.org/licenses/by/3.0. You can reach Leo Jones and Neurologic by email at neurologicpodcast@gmail.com.